Welcome, everyone. This is Jim Satterfield. We're certainly glad to be with you today and hope that your December and holiday plans are all in full swing. We're going to take a look back at 2017 and view it from a crisis perspective and see what lessons we've learned and some of the insights that we can all share today. This is part of the 2017 Crisis Coach webinar series that we're doing with the Virginia Association of Independent Schools, and we're glad that you're joining with us today. We'd like you to be our friend on social media, and you can see a bunch of opportunities listed there, and there is a hashtag for today's session, and that's hashtag Crisis Coach. There is a disclaimer. Everybody has attorneys. They need to have some justification in their life, and it's not today's presentation isn't complete without the oral comments, and any work product from Firestorm needs to be read in conjunction with guidance from your local authorities as well as your personal counsel. And today is not legal advice. And as you can tell with a lot of things that have been going on in the news, there are an awful lot of people that need some legal advice now. So Firestorm transforms crisis into value, and we empower you to manage crisis and risk. Our expertise is in the area of crisis management, critical decision support, crisis communications, crisis public relations, and consequence management. Firestorm is America's crisis coach, and it's that push and pull between crisis and risk that we're always associated with, and we follow a predict, plan, perform methodology. We've got with us today Kim from the Virginia Association of Independent Schools and Ken Mercer from Firestorm. Kim, we'll start with you. Any comments for us today?
Well, good morning, everyone. As always, I've mentioned before, we value our relationship with Firestorm, and we value these monthly webinar series to keep us informed. But as you will remember, we also have a couple of other benefits, such as the crisis response and also a school preparedness assessment with Firestorm. And if you want to learn any more about those, feel free to contact me at the VAIS office. But thank you again, Bill.
Well, I'm glad that you did that. And if any school finds itself in a crisis, pick up the phone and give us a call. There is no charge for that first hour, and because it's the decisions you make, the actions you take, and the words that you say are going to determine, does this stabilize or increase? And we'll have some new services to share with you in next month's webinar. And you see on the screen that you can go to firestorm.com, watch previous webinars. You can even download materials from there. Ken, anything you want to add to today's session?
Good morning, all. I am Ken Mercer, and I will be the one following up with each of you after this presentation. Thank you so much for joining us, and thank you especially to the Virginia Association of Independent Schools for underwriting this and making it available to you. Thank you very much. Thank you, Jim.
All right. Well, we'll move along a little bit here. And I'm Jim Satterfield, I'm the president, CEO, and co-founder of Firestorm, and this is our 13th year that we're starting this year. As we think about the year, we want to think about all the events that we've seen, and I would ask if you've been taking notes, the number of incidents that have occurred, the number of crises, and we want to go through what we've learned this year and try to focus some of our attention and discussion today. And I'm going to take a little bit of a different format in today's webinar. There is an infographic. I'm not a graphics person, but that just means it's a whole list of information in a continuous document. So we're going to open that document, go to it, and let you see some of the things. And by the way, you can download, and we'll show you how to do that at the end of the webinar today, this infographic. And we do those fairly often that give you insights into crisis communications or cyber or violence or particular exposures. But this is one just reviewing the year and giving you a sense of where we are and what we're going to do. So I'm going to kind of go out of my slide deck, and this is live show business, so you get to see everything come up as it is. All right, so you should be seeing hashtag a year in crisis 2017, and you're seeing just straight off my computer as we look at it. As we go through it, we have put the crises that we've seen into a couple of buckets. One's related to violence, ones that are non-violent crises but have other things that have occurred. We're also going to deal with some natural disasters associated with it and share some of those elements. So you'll be seeing the screen as I scroll down it. This is one long continuous document, and it's a little bit of a different way to think about what's going on. And if you'll think back to the very start of the year, we had the shooting in the airport in Hollywood. 5 people were shot by a gunman who came into the baggage claim area, and we got started off right at the beginning of the year with those types of violence events. The recap over to the left-hand column, and as you look at an infographic, generally it's set up with various columns, and what we'll do is you'll see some of those areas, but the key question asked in that left-hand column is, if it's happening to you, then it is really a crisis. I often talk about major surgeries, any surgery on me. So if it's happening to your school or your family, if you look at the right, where that big 50% jumps up right there in your face, we do research and we do regular surveys. As you can imagine, the webinars that we do over the course of a year, literally hundreds and hundreds of schools and businesses respond. But interestingly, one of the questions we ask is, how confident are you? How concerned are you about your ability to respond to an active shooter situation? And over half of all responders had indicated that they were very concerned about that. And I think that's one of the things that affect all of us as we think about the education market and we think about the services that you're doing. Just recently, you saw the story out of New Mexico where a substitute teacher saved 17 children in these types of events. And there's a program that Firestorm does that we have, that we certainly would be glad to talk with your school around, and it's called Behavioral Risk Threat Assessment, identifying those behaviors of concern before they escalate to violence. And if you'd like to know more about that Bertha program, Ken and Firestorm would be delighted to share. So we're going to talk about these types of episodes. Imagine the travel coming up and over the holidays and the way that airports are crowded, the level of concern that exists in each of those areas. Now, as we scroll down a little bit, we have violence occurring in a variety of different ways. And you've got the United Airlines story that came up from the spring. By the way, if you become synonymous with a crisis or a disaster, the name of your school fits into that area, it becomes a defining moment for you. And we all saw the pictures of the passenger being drugged down the aisle on a United Airlines flight from Chicago to Louisville. And that doctor was literally mugged by the security associated with it. And he had a ticket. He did everything right. They responded inappropriately. And then there was confusion by the president of United Airlines in his comments that he said, and it ultimately cost him from moving on into the seat of chairman of the board of United. So if your school becomes synonymous with something, it certainly changes a significant difference. And so that's why it's important to think about the plans and issues that we have. Now, if in many live meetings, I'll stop and do a survey of the audience and talk about the state flowers. I'm not sure what the state flower of Virginia is. Perhaps you know. I'm down in Georgia, and the state flower of Georgia is the Cherokee rose. But if you think about other states, let's take Colorado, you'll be surprised to learn that the state flower of Colorado is columbine. But when you hear that name, you don't think about the state flower, you think about the shootings that were there. So crisis defines and becomes those types of things, and that's part of the issues that we're associated with. That right-hand set of percentages over there, the 39, 33, and 28, the people in our organization would never do anything unethical that might jeopardize the survival of the company. staggeringly, I thought that the fact that 72% of the people either were unsure or thought that in fact they could. And when we look at the news stories that are coming out across the country and the inappropriate contact in the workplace or in the school environment, we also saw through the course of the year numerous cases where inappropriate sexual contact between teachers and students going back years in time, and the statute of limitations in most states have now been lifted. And so we're seeing increasingly organizations being identified for something that happened 10, 20, 30, or even 40 years ago. So as we think about this, violence has a way of continuing to increase. So creating this culture within the organization for you becomes important. We also had other shootings that occurred. Here in April is the one that happened in Missouri, and it's a gas employee. Imagine somebody going out to cut off the gas in an area becoming a target. And then over in the left-hand column, you see the story coming out of Orlando where they thwarted an alleged mass shooting scenario by young people at the school, that they were in the middle of planning that and were able to have it uncovered because somebody saw something that didn't look right. So observing around you, observing those behaviors of concerns makes a big difference. When we did the research and surveyed across not only schools but businesses, that right-hand column again, it shows that a significant portion of the organization, only 40%, don't have a program to identify behaviors of concern before they escalate to violence. 37% said they did. Some said they have some stuff in writing, but they don't follow it. And 9% said, yep, we've got it documented and we've tested it. So that 37% weakens greatly when you look at the fact that it's not an ingrained portion. So we become regularly surprised by these elements that occur, and they start to happen. Now, violence occurred not only in schools and in work environments. We had the concert in the UK. Clearly, we also had several terrorist events there with vehicles driving as you've seen it. And one of the things that we identified is that the types of events that we're seeing in the UK will be coming to the US. And we've been talking about that for well over a year. And unfortunately, we have seen that prediction become true. As you've heard us talk many times about following a predict, plan, perform scenario, that is what we're looking at and seeing it occurred. You looked at the worker over there in the right-hand column. The gunman, he did the shootings down, and this was a company with only 34 people in it, where he had come back and he'd been an employee there and cited for violence before. So looking at what's happening here makes a difference. And when you go to a concert, when you're in a venue, having situational awareness of what's going on around you becomes very important. Knowing what to do, where to go, and how to respond. Firestorm does assessments for security with providing protection from deadly weapons and active shooters. So understanding what's at your property and how it needs to be dealt with makes a big difference. And it's not just looking at schools and normal businesses. Look over on the left-hand column. We had the shooting in the hospital from the disgruntled doctor who brought a rifle into work. Healthcare workers are at high risk because of the drugs and the areas that are involved. And so violence is a significant exposure in that marketplace as you think about it. Just down the road from you, you had the protests that erupted in Charlottesville around the Confederate statues and the directions there. And the violence, and there was actually a death associated with it. We had an individual who drove the car into the crowd, if you remember. So we are in a situation in America where we don't speak with each other, we speak at each other. And that change puts us at a different level of exposure. We also aren't just dealing with violence from that. It could be something else that happens physically at an event. And you had the Ohio State Fair. If you remember, we had a piece of equipment that malfunctioned and caused death associated with it. Again, in the right-hand column, you'll look at the concern level of associated with workplace violence is up at 89%, 39% very concerned, 50% somewhat concerned. If you see a theme in this part of the presentation today, it is this violence element. Again, we speak to a lot of groups around the country, and I'll ask a question about, do you see violence decreasing? Do you see it staying the same? Or are you just seeing it increase? Uniformly, the discussion is that violence is in fact increasing in that perception. OSHA, who tracks safety in the workplace, has identified that there are 2 million episodes of workplace violence annually in the United States. Now, not everyone's a shooting, but if you look at the types of events that occur, and particularly in a school environment, it has to be a major concern. If you add to the 2 million episodes of violence, the 2 million episodes of bullying in our schools, and that's both physical as well as cyber, you start to see that we're in an environment that's certainly unstable. We had the shootings in Charleston in just a regular restaurant by a former coworker. The statistics generally are in most of these events, the shootings occur from someone that you know, a current employee or a former employee, same thing with a student, is a much more likely person to have generated it. And then we had the large shooting event in Las Vegas. We all watched that unfold and the large numbers that were dead and injured in that. And that's the second type of a concert venue. Now, when we go to a concert, we're going there to have fun, we're going to hear, but those types of events could certainly come through and come in to be a factor associated with it. And it's not just in a public setting like this, it could be in a much quieter, imagine the holiday concert at your school. What are you doing in those areas that could certainly come together? There is a book you can download off our website for free. By the way, that's our best price, called Disaster Ready People for a Disaster Ready America. And it's about doing a plan at home. It's certainly something that you want to encourage your teachers to do because their family trumps job and they need to have a plan at home. It could also be a fundraiser for you. And if you have questions about that, Ken can fill in. Again, over on the right, I'm confident in my ability to respond appropriately to a loss of life incident on our property. You'll see that over half the people, 57%, felt that they weren't prepared. The hardest thing you're ever going to have to do is pick up that phone and call a parent and say your child is not coming home from school today. So being prepared to deal with this, understanding the shelter in place, evacuate, lockdown, lockout, having a reunification program of how you bring people together, those are standards that you want to be thinking about for 2018. Back to the center, we've got that bike attack where the vehicle was taken as a terrorist attack in New York City and ran down the people. That's exactly what we were seeing in London. We talked about it coming here, and in fact, it's now here. Look for this trend to continue. Whenever you're out, we don't want to create paranoia, but situational awareness of what's going on around you, whether it's a concert or just walking down the street, those are opportunities for you to think about. So we want to encourage you to think about not waiting until that weapon arrives, but having a plan in front to deal with those behaviors of concern. And then we all saw the shootings in November at the Baptist Church in Texas. Rural area, you would think it was very calm and would be a peaceful area, and we saw the devastation associated with it. But again, in these events, there are warning signs that they could be identified with and changed. So nonviolent crises, let's move on and talk about things that aren't necessarily a violent related event. You'll look over in the left-hand column. Apple had to dismiss an engineer after his daughter's picture of their product before it went out, the iPhone 10 as it came out. By the way, it was interesting in the news to hear it talked about X, the iPhone X, and they didn't make the association to Roman numerals. They must not have listened in your classes along the way. Convention Bureau, who they streamed a sex video out. I think maybe a lot of people might want to not go to that convention area. You've also had a mix-up in a printing company who revealed thousands of sensitive documents from a law firm associated with it. Cyber breach is an increasing concern that impacts all of us, and we've seen multiple stories. The little statistics that we've got in the right-hand column, again from our survey, you'll notice that 92% were either somewhat or very concerned about their data being breached. Increasingly, we're seeing schools being targeted and independent schools because you have not only the financial information around the families, you have personal health information or HIPAA-related documents, and your confidentiality area would make it a target. We had utilities under attack, and unfortunately, I think that area is going to expand in 2018. We had a massive power outage in San Francisco. If you lose electricity, you go back 150 years in time. Think about what's happening. Then we did a little note there in that middle column about who's held responsible in a crisis, and it's going to be your leadership within your school. Your parents and your students and your teachers are looking at you in those areas. And the information is going to get out. So you have to be very careful. And it said 80% of the people when we surveyed indicated that they thought information, in fact, would get out and be shared. As we were talking about cyber attacks, we've certainly seen more than our share this year. Phishing attack on Gmail users, there was a device put into place. The left-hand column is another infographic, kind of like the one we're going through, but it's all about cybersecurity. You can download that off our website, and it will give you some very good insights into what to look for. And let me introduce a term for you to think about, and that term is called picnic, P-I-C-N-I-C, just like going on a picnic, but it stands for problem in chair, not in computer. The big vulnerability that we have in all of our organizations and our schools is the human element. Clicking on a link, downloading a document that you shouldn't, introduces the virus, introduces the keystroke logger, brings the criminal directly into your organization. So training your teachers, training your students, what they should do and should not do will be one of the best protections that you can have. You'll notice that at corporations, 48% have trained their employees about the phishing attempts that are occurring so that they know what to do, and that area will be going up, and you're going to see new legislation even in those areas. The Equifax breach affected everybody on our call. The number of that credit bureau and the information that was out there really affected all of us to be taken into those areas. There's a brief out there that you can read around cyber crises in 2017. Again, you can download it all off the website. As we move away from those types of events, we want to think a little bit about natural disasters. It seems that we had an exceptionally large number in 2017 compared to some of the previous years. In August, we had the tornado that struck Tulsa. If you'll look at that, 25 people were injured. There was, I think, 120 businesses or so that were incapacitated within it. There was a winter storm, Stella, 5 feet of snow in some areas. That's a lot of snow to be putting into one place. And when we look at the hurricanes that came in, and that's a little further down, if you remember the hurricane that came in through Texas stopped in an area and they had over 4 feet of rain. Disasters of the physical nature, where we talk about crises, are certainly ones that we want to be prepared for. The tornado was 120 businesses in Tulsa that were impacted. That Stella storm, the earthquake in Mexico, 7.1, the 250 deaths, the collapse of the buildings. Earthquakes can happen across the U.S. and certainly in California and along the Mississippi and those areas, but we've even had them up and down the West Coast to think about those directions. Look at the graphic to the right. 50% of you were unsure of your ability to assure the health of your people if they were confined there. In many cases, if the infrastructure is damaged, you may have the children in your school there for an extended period. Have you thought about how you would handle those and manage and support them? The hurricane season that I mentioned was one of the most active, with over $200 billion worth of damages. Harvey, Irma, Maria. Puerto Rico is still in disarray, and as the figures are coming in more and more out of Puerto Rico, we're seeing that over 1,000 people died in the statistics that we're seeing. The disruption that occurred associated with it has been very, very widespread. And it impacts us in a variety of ways, and the family and relatives of your students and faculty were there. Firestorm was acquired in 2017 in January by Novum, N-O-V-U-M-E, and it gives us access into additional resources. One of those is a television show that's in your area. It's called The Bridge. It airs on Sunday mornings after Good Morning America on ABC and just before the news show that would appear after. So you've got a half an hour show, and it talks about a variety of different topics. And we have a new EVP and Chief Operating Officer at Firestorm, Hart Brown, who was there talking about natural disaster and emergency planning. You've probably been following all of the wildfire events out in California, and the devastation has been excessive. Now, the Red Cross states that there are over 70,000 disasters annually in the U.S. The majority of those are fires. So what you're seeing in California that happened in the north with the wine country in October, and what's happening right now just outside of L.A., the devastation is unbelievable. Imagine if that was your house where the chimney is standing in the picture, and what that's going to mean. What does it mean to your students in areas? So fire is one of the most normal and largest exposures that we have from natural disasters as those events come together. So there's some tips for business resilience you can go and get off our website. You can share with us. There's another infogram there on communicating during a crisis. You'll see in the right. You can go to our website and download that. And you can follow us on lots of different sites and places. Again, more information. And again, that predict, plan, perform methodology. Have you thought about what the exposures and risk are within your school? Do you have a plan to address each of those? And do you have triggers to activate your plan associated with it? So I wanted to show you this infographic because a lot of times we tell you things are there and you don't really understand how to use it. But this could give you an opportunity to start the discussion within your school to better understand where we are and what's going on. So let's get started again back in our slide deck. So we covered this, and I would be remiss if I didn't talk about the events that occurred yesterday in New York City. A second terrorist attack. We had the car attack earlier in the fall, and then yesterday the bomb in the Port Authority right there at Times Square. And again, it was a terrorist. He was giving ISIS credit for putting it together. The only thing that made a difference here was he was not good at designing his his pipe bomb. Hey, let me take a little drink of water here. And while it went off, it did not have the impact that he had hoped it would. Again, I want to encourage you when you're out and about to have situational awareness of what's going on around you. All of the things that are happening today make us at a higher risk from a terrorist environment than we've been in a number of years. If you're thinking about communications in these types of areas, there are three types of communications in a crisis. The first, which is the most important, is coordination. What is it that you want people to do? Shelter in place, evacuate, lock down, lock out. Those are things that need to be ingrained in every part of your school and your preparedness. We're very blessed in America that in the last 50 years, we've not had a single child die in a school fire. What a great achievement. How was that done? Well, changes in building codes, fire detection, alarms, sprinklers, drills on evacuation to make sure that we all understood what needed to be done. But if you think about violence, we can't say that there hasn't been a child who's died as a result of violence in our schools in 50 years, or 50 months, or 50 weeks, or 50 days, or even 50 hours. When you think about this, this is a growing expression of exposure, and we have to change how we operate in our schools. Ken would be glad to share with you information about the behavioral risk threat assessment program that Firestorm is doing, and there's now a new online training program associated with it that can be included from the University of Alabama so that your team within your organization could figure out how they would deal with those types of behaviors before they escalate. The second types of communications are those around the crisis itself, the brand and reputation, and generally the next is the compliance. You're required to notify those regulators or the authorities in these types of crisis events. Generally, if you find yourself in a crisis area, you don't want to be talking about the specifics of the events. The authorities will be dealing with those. This gives you an opportunity to talk about the fact that you'll not be defined by the event, that you'll invent the future and embrace the families. By inventing the future, we're talking about what procedures are you putting in place to make sure it won't happen again, and putting the attention on those that were directly impacted. But your school is not about that bad thing that occurred. And then you can talk about what is the mission of your school and how you've done. The quote from the mayor of Las Vegas follows this type of an approach. This has been a resilient community who will not be defined by this sick, disgusting human being, the person who did the shooting and attacking at that point. So what are you missing? If you look over to the right in that circle, you'll see you know what you know. What you don't, and you know a bunch about what you don't know. But the biggest exposure you have is that blue portion of the circle is what you don't know that you don't know. Keeping up with what's going on in your school, in your community, the changes that are starting to happen. The chances are that the largest exposure will be coming from that section, and that's the area that you want to constantly be looking at. Anonymous reporting is an example of a response. There are 5 common failures in a disaster. Supply chain failures, the first, failure to train your people for how to respond in that crisis, both at home and at work. The failure to identify and monitor all threat risk. If you've identified a threat or a risk to your school, how do you monitor it, and what are the triggers that are going to activate your plan? Number 4, failure to conduct exercises and update your plans. The story about the fire drills is true. Updating and testing your plans, making sure that you've got the right information at the right time. And then lastly, failure to have a crisis communications plan, having your messaging planned in advance. Now, this is a maturity model, and it's important to think about how do we see us doing in making decisions in a crisis. Remember, in a crisis, almost everything you find out initially is wrong, and you're going to be forced to make decisions on wrong and incomplete information. That's why having a structure about how you go about that becomes so very, very critical. And we focus on the decision process, the roles and responsibilities, the information clarity, the speed of decision making, and the communications effectiveness. Most of our schools are generally in that liability surprise area, or maybe some have moved to the basic reaction mode. As you move from it being a stage 1 up to a stage 2, that's a control breakthrough. If you can move beyond that to where it's supportive and is part of pre-action, that's an alignment breakthrough. And then finally, if it's part of your culture, it's who your school is, it's strategic, that's a value breakthrough. You're looking to move from the left of this chart to your right, but you're going to be measured by the weakest area. So if you were 2s and 3s, or maybe even a 4 in one of those areas, but you were scored down at a liability level, that's going to bring down your ability to respond in a crisis to that lowest level. So these are types of things that you can take and use to measure how you're doing in responding to and looking at the crises as they occur. So the time to act is now. Firestorm follows a predict, plan, perform methodology. Predict, understand the vulnerabilities, the impacts, how you monitor them, what are the triggers, what's the plan, what do you want everybody to do, do you have it documented? And then finally, perform, that's the training, it's the testing, getting the equipment and supplies associated with it to be there. Now, there is an opportunity to download the graphic that we went through, this infographic. You can go to firestorm.com/2017 year in review, and you would get the same document that I have. I think it would be a good one for you to use to start to have a conversation in your school about where are we, what do we need to do. Beyond that, there's a couple of other opportunities. There's a study that you can participate in about incident management, how events impact organizations. It's an opportunity for you to go through and do and supply that information, and it's a report that there's a new open survey, and you've got the link here that you can participate in it. And the beauty is, if you do, then you get a copy of that analysis when it comes out. I also want to remind you about the webinar next year. The first one in the series will be in January, and it's helping your organization make the most of 2018. Now is the time to plan and prepare for the future. We have some new solutions that we're going to be sharing with you. You can click on the registration link and register for that. And again, the cost of these webinars are being underwritten by the Virginia Association of Independent Schools. Here's a chance for you to get a head start on the year to help get your priorities in place of what do we need to do. My hope is that when we think about the year in review in December of 2018, we're not putting up a picture about a story that happened in your town, a picture or a story that happened at your school, a picture or a story that happened to your students, your parents, or your teachers. So planning here, we want to make the most of what we have from an opportunity. So our thanks back to the Virginia Association of Independent Schools, and certainly all that they do to help each of you. Kim, any observations you want to make as we start to wind down a little bit today?
No, but thank you, Bill. It sounds to me like you've given us a list of very practical New Year's resolutions to really get going on in January. So thank you.
It's our pleasure, and I think that you're exactly right. Now is the time to be prepared, because how do we know that 2018 will be better than 2017. Ken, as we start to wind down, anything you want to add?
No, Jim, thank you very much for the presentation today. I look forward to speaking to each of you on the call today. I will be the one following up with you, and thank you for joining us. And thank you, Kim, for allowing us to present this. Thank you.
Well, I hope Santa Claus finds everybody this year. I know you've all been good and not naughty, but nice, and that's an excellent time to be together. If you've got questions about what we went over today, you can go to firestorm.com, download that infographic and the others that I talked about behaviors of concern and cyber or communicating in a crisis. All of that information is available to you that you can carry forward. If you've got a question, you can send it to webinars@firestorm.com. If you find yourself in a crisis, or if you just would like to talk to one of us about this material, you can call us at 800-321-2219. Thanks for all you do every day at school. You have a calling. You're making a difference in the lives of our young people, in their education. Their growth as a person becomes extremely important. No child should ever be afraid to go to school. Unfortunately, we can't guarantee today that that's not happening. There was a news story this week about a young man who called his mom and asked her to come pick him up at school because he was being picked on. Not cyber, but physically at school. We're living in a time where behaviors of concern are increasing, not decreasing. It's going to become critical for your school to identify those that need help early and not wait until it rises to an element of violence. There was a national news story this morning that 1 in 5 children have some portion of mental illness, that their brain has not developed the way that it needed to in certain areas. And the good news is there are treatments that can help. There's interventions that can make a difference. It's never appropriate to think boys will be boys, things will happen. This violence epidemic that we're in is a real one. We all have a responsibility to each other to create a safe school environment. Thank you again for being a part of the webinar today, and I look forward to speak with you again next month as we talk about planning for 2018. Have a great day, everyone. Thanks, and Merry Christmas. Goodbye.